Jim, tell us how it is that Neal and Harwell came into being. That's been your base of operation now for over 30 years. And how did that happen?
Well, can we stop the camera a minute?
Jim, we were talking about the beginning of the Neal and Harwell law firm. And tell us how it is that that firm came into being.
Well, beginning in certainly in 1968, I was getting a great deal of what's now called white-collar criminal business. I had prosecuted and convicted Eve Hoover when I was U.S. Attorney, who had a big trucking company and other things, road building. And he was getting in trouble, and he came to me and said, if you're smart enough to convict me and put me in prison, you ought to be smart enough to keep me out. And so he was under indictment. I started representing him. The Commissioner of Fire and Police in Chattanooga, the famous Bookie Turner, was being indicted by the federal government, and he'd come to me. And I saw that this was probably going to be the way I'd spend most of my time in the practice of law thereafter. And it was just it could have carried on there, but it just didn't fit the practice that was the Cornelius, Collin, Neal, and Higgins regular practice. So I thought this is a good time to maybe try it on my own. And you had been helping me in the white collar part of the practice, and so I said, hey, you want to try it? Want to go out and start our own firm? I guarantee you we don't have a single dollar that we know will come in. But if you want to do it, we'll start January 1, 1971, and we'll create our own firm of Neal, Harwell, and
Neal, Carzon, and Harwell.
Neal, Carzon, and Harwell at that time.
Before we get to that, Jim, at that time, there were those who suggested that given your success, and given your notoriety, that you were taking a significant risk by having a 28-year-old associate in the Cornelius firm join you as a partner in the new firm.
Well, we were both taking a risk. I was taking a risk, you were taking a risk. We didn't have any income that we knew would come in. As a matter of fact, we made the point to say we would not take one single client whose work we had done from that firm, and we didn't. I was representing General Motors that time in civil matters, and we told General Motors we would not take them. We were representing Continental Insurance Company. We told them we would not take that with us. We were both taking a chance, but I knew that you were hardworking. I knew you had a lot of bullshit you could put out and attract clients, and I knew that I thought we'd succeed, but it certainly was a risk for me. It was a risk for you. It wasn't long, however, that General Motors said, we want to come with you all. And General Motors came over. Wasn't long with Continental Insurance Company. Bill somebody headed the office here. And they came over. And it grew on from there. But it's a risk from both sides. Always a risk when you go out and you don't know. You know that you're going to have expenses. We had figured that for the year 1971, we thought we'd have an expense of $24,000 would be our total expense. And we had to make that before we could make anything for ourselves. Well, it took off from that, and got to where I can't believe what our expenses are today.
As a matter of fact, if you'll recall, we sought a credit line so that we could fund that $24,000 expense from one of the Nashville banks. You remember that? I
do remember it. I remember the bank. I remember a bank turned us down. It was within the First American Bank. And we went, then we met Sam Fleming somehow, and great old Sam Fleming, we asked him to borrow $50,000, and Sam Fleming says, no, I won't loan you $50,000, but I'll loan you $75,000. And so we borrowed the money, and Sam Fleming became a great friend of ours and stayed that way until he died a few years ago.
One of the things that some people find of interest, Jim, is that we had the first female lawyer not only as a partner in this profession in Nashville, but also as a name partner, Larry Carzon.
Mm-hmm.
And the firm initially was known as Neal, Carzon and Harwell, you'll recall. Tell us how it is that Larry Carzon came to be a partner in the early days of what is now Neal and Harwell.
Aubrey, I have no recollection.
Let me suggest to you that you had come to know her by virtue of her having worked for Performance Systems, which was the successor company to Mini Pearl Chicken.
She was a lawyer for John J. Hooker Jr.'s company, known as first as Mini Pearl Chicken, and then as Performance System. And I thought highly of her, and I said, "We're starting this thing out, Larry. Do you want to take a big gamble?" It wasn't such a big gamble for Larry because her husband was Dr. David Carzon, and he was the head of the Children's Hospital at Vanderbilt, I remember. But she did come aboard, and when there are people who say, much to my surprise, that Neal and Harwell is some sort of a male chauvinist firm or something because they don't have a female partner. It's hard for me to believe because one of our first partner was a female.
Whose name was over mine in the letterhead.
His name was over yours in the letterhead, and we stayed that way for what, a year? It wasn't long.
A couple of years.
She wanted to go out and be a general counsel of some company.
Of Aladdin.
Aladdin Industries.
Victor Johnson, who was a good friend of hers and who
Right.
shared Aladdin,
Right.
and who was a great client of ours, insisted that she come out and open
Right.
their legal department.
Right.
Jim, while we don't want to get too far afield, you'll also recall that Sixth Circuit Judge Sissy Daughtry was also a great friend of ours, and we supported her when the legal profession in Nashville had some significant prejudice against women.
Yeah, and it pardon the expression, pisses me off when I hear now that somehow we're a male chauvinist law firm. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Jim, you've been called a lawyer's lawyer. You have been featured in various publications, various periodicals as being one of the lawyers most sought after when someone's in deep trouble or when a corporation's in a bet the company mode. You have been featured in article after article and referred to as one of the top trial lawyers in the nation. Share with us some of that which you believe has caused you to be so unbelievably successful and to gain such national recognition and respect as a trial lawyer. Then we're going to talk about some of your cases.
Well, the number one ingredient is pure, blind, dumb luck. Above all else, luck. Luck to be reasonably healthy, stay reasonably healthy, have good peasant genes in your body. Luck to have a mentor or a person who promotes you into a big case with a lot of notoriety, like Bob Kennedy. And that gives you your start, and then an awful lot of hard work. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, but you do have to have luck, and you do have to get that first big break. You know the old line, full many is the flower that's born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness in the desert air. There are full many fine lawyers out there who never get that first boost over the hump.
Jim, there are those that say that you are more prepared on the law and on the facts than any other lawyer when you walk in a courtroom. There are those that say that you are so totally committed to winning or so totally opposed to losing that you will pay whatever price necessary. Is that true?
Well, I certainly try. I certainly don't pay an ethical price. I believe, always maintained scrupulously or adhered scrupulously to the ethics of our profession. I think that's important for long-range success. You can engage in some sharp practices, cut some corners, but most people I know who cut corners, engage in sharp practices, don't have a long career. And of course, I've had a long career. Preparation is the main thing about trying cases, to know more than anybody else in the courtroom about the case. Preparation, stamina, that's about it.
Jim, we're in a time in the evolution of this profession when there is significant criticism that we fail as lawyers to train and to guide our young lawyers, and we don't provide mentoring the way we did 25 or 30 years ago. You have been my mentor and that of other partners who've been very successful in this firm and others around the country. Tell us how it was in the old days when you were focused on mentoring and training people who were below you in this firm and others.
Well, somehow it seemed that we had more time. And we'd have time to sit around in the late afternoon, have a drink of scotch. That always helped mentoring, you know. And to talk about cases or talk about legal issues. Somehow we're so busy now that we don't have, or at least don't take that time. Second, it's much more difficult to mentor now for a lot of reasons. There's not as many trials now. There's not as many trials, absolutely. And certainly with the explosion of the number of lawyers, there's far fewer opportunities to get in the courtroom and try cases than it was when I was coming up. So you have that. You also have now in this modern era the sentencing guidelines in criminal cases and the white collar cases that you and I try, which penalize severely going to trial. It's amazing. If you go to trial and you lose, you're penalized severely. You're penalized because you're not given the benefit of, quote, acceptance of responsibility. You may be further penalized if you get on the stand and tell your side of the story and you have to be convicted. The judge can conclude that you committed obstruction of justice, i.e. perjury, further penalized. So anybody who's in what you and I do now recognize the huge penalty of going to trial, and that promotes plea bargaining, and again, fewer trials.
Jim, for more than 30 years, you've been involved in some of the most highly publicized, high-profile cases in the country. And while that all began with the prosecution of Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa, few have succeeded in going forward successfully in case after case after case. I guess after Hoffa, the next really big case that received national, international publicity was the case that came to be known as the Watergate case.
Well, there were a couple of regional cases before that. The hijacking case that started out in Nashville here and ended up in Jacksonville.
Tell us about the hijacking case, and then we'll move on to the national cases from the regional.
Okay, which is the toughest case I've ever tried. A Big Brothers aircraft plane was hijacked out of Nashville by a person who was a professor at Peabody College, George Giff. He was a strange bird who said he was a warlock. He claimed to be a member of the former member of the CIA. He was a strange bird. He had a wife. He and his wife were estranged, and she was Miss Tennessee at one time. And he had a buddy by the name of Bobby Wayne Wallace. They went to Murfreesboro together, Middle Tennessee State University together in those days, and he induced Bobby Wayne Wallace to take him and his estranged wife to a plane they had chartered to go to the Bahamas, allegedly. They were going to try to reconcile. And then the bizarre incident that when they got to the airport, George Giff shoved a gun at Bobby Wayne Wallace and made him help, this is my position, help him hijack the plane. They took off, they flew to Jacksonville, landed at Jacksonville Airport. The FBI surrounded the plane, the pilot and the co-pilot and the real hijacker, his wife, and my client, Bobby Wayne Wallace, was in the plane. The hijacker told the pilot to get with the aircraft tower and air control tower, and tell them they needed to refuel and take off. And the FBI said there's no refueling, there'll be no takeoff, cut your engines. With that, the FBI started to approach the plane, shoot the tires out. And George Giff before that happened, George Giff let the co-pilot off and let my client off to try to talk the FBI into letting them refuel and take off. They surrounded my guy. He happened to have a big gun in his belt at that time. They surrounded him, Bobby Wayne Wallace, threw him to the ground, arrested him, and then again told the pilot that there'd be no refueling, no takeoff. You could hear this on a tape played between the pilot and the control tower. The FBI had taken over the control tower. And the pilot is trying to get the FBI to allow him to refuel and take off, and the FBI is saying there'll be no refueling, cut your engines. With that, the FBI started shooting the tires of the plane, and George Giff killed the pilot, his wife, and himself. And Bobby Wayne Wallace was from this area, and his brother-in-law was a friend of mine from Portland, Tennessee, and the cousin of a guy that I played football with, who went with me to University of Wyoming to play football. So I went to Jacksonville, got local counsel down there, defended the hijacker, the alleged hijacker, and extremely tough case, but my client was acquitted on all counts. But that was the top story in Florida that year.
That was also the first airplane hijacking case ever prosecuted in this country, was it not?
Ever tried all the way through.
All the way through, prosecuted all the way through, right.
And then a couple of other, 2 or 3 or 4 other cases, and then came Watergate.
The Bobby Wayne Wallace case, while high publicity in Nashville and while significantly noteworthy in Florida, was, as you suggest earlier, regional.
Right.
The next really big national case, which had the kind of coverage that the prosecution of Hoffa had, was Watergate, was it not?
Yes.
There's a great story about how you came to be involved in the Watergate case and the long-time relationship you had with Archibald Cox. Share that with us.
Well, in May of 1973, Archie Cox was named the Watergate Special Prosecutor. Archie Cox was Solicitor General in the Kennedy Justice Department. And he calls me up and says, I've been named the Watergate Prosecutor, Jim. You're the only one I know, because I was a young lawyer in the Department of Justice, and Archie Cox was an older lawyer and Solicitor General, but Bob Kennedy had a habit of having people up in his office to kick things around with him, whether they be in your area or not. And invariably I'd go up. Archie Cox, of course, the Solicitor General, would be there. And I come to know Archie that way, so he called me and said, Jim, you're the only man I know who knows anything about criminal law. Archie Cox was a longtime professor of Harvard Law School at that time. So I said, Archie, I'll come up for 3 weeks. I'm just 73. We've just been in business for 2 years. I said, man, I'm got a new law firm here. I'll come up for 3 weeks, Archie. And that was in May of 73. I stayed until Archie was fired in the so-called Saturday Night Massacre in October of 73. I'd come back just the night before he was fired, but I told Archie he's going to be fired. Nixon was going to fire him.
The Nixon you referred to was then President Richard Nixon.
Right. And as it turned out, it took him, when Nixon told And the reason Nixon fired him was because Archie Cox was trying to get the White House tapes, insisting on getting the White House tapes. And when he wouldn't cease and desist, Nixon told Elliot Richardson, who was Attorney General, to fire Cox. Elliot Richardson, who was an old Boston Brayman with Archie Cox, said he's not going to do it. I promised him I wouldn't fire him as long as he didn't do anything wrong. He's not doing anything wrong. I'm not going to fire him. Nixon fired Elliot Richardson. Then the Deputy Attorney General, whose name escapes me right now, became Attorney General. William Ruckelshaus became Acting Attorney General, and Nixon told Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus refused and resigned. And then the then Solicitor General became Acting Attorney General, Robert Bork. And of course that guy fired Cox. And shortly thereafter, Leon Jaworski was appointed Watergate Special Prosecutor, and this is now into early '74, and Leon Jaworski called me and said, we're about ready to indict the former Attorney General, the former White House Chief of Staff, Haldeman, the former Chief Domestic Advisor, John Ehrlichman, former counsel John Dean, former counsel Charles Colson. I want you to come back and try the big case. And said, Nixon will be named an unindicted co-conspirator. So then, 1 year after I first went up, in May of '74, I went back. And this time I stayed and prosecuted the former Attorney General, former Chief White House Chief of Staff Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Colson, Dean, etc. And the jury came back with a verdict against these people on New Year's Day, 1975. And that afternoon, right after the verdict, I came back to Nashville. And that's my almost 2 years at Watergate.
Jim, Leon Jaworski had been the president of the American Bar Association, fairly high profile. Archibald Cox, as you indicated, had been the Solicitor General.
Right.
But the truth of the matter is, once the actual trial began, you were the man who was the talking head.
Yeah,
Was
they didn't have any trial experience.
That's right. He was oftentimes interviewed, who was constantly day in and day out on network television.
Right.
When you agreed to prosecute in the Watergate case, it represented a significant negative financial element in your life, did it not? You took a substantial cut in pay to leave the then Neal and Harwell law firm and to go up.
I sure was, yeah. I didn't know it would be a substantial pay cut when you and I started, but as it turned out, we were successful enough, it was a substantial pay cut.
And the day came, as you recall, when the government regulations at that point required your total withdrawal from the Neal and
I had to
Harwell
resign from the firm, right.
And so for a period of over a year, this firm was reconstituted as the law offices of Aubrey Harwell.
Right.
And then I welcomed you back in
Thank God.
1975.
Yeah. Thank God. Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that in late '74 and early '75, you were inundated with offers to practice law in Washington, to practice law in New York, and to join nationally recognized firms.
Right.
Why is it you opted to come back to Nashville, Tennessee, to what you say was a fledgling law firm when you left 3 years earlier?
Come back to see you, my buddy. I wanted to. There's something about roots. There's something about Aubrey, walking down the street and seeing so many people that you've known for 40, 50 years. See George Barrett, whom I've known since 1954. To see Tom Higgins, whom I've known at the same time, and on and on and on. It's there's a root factor there, and of course I think Nashville is a grand city, and I wanted to come back to practice, and I knew that we would continue to be successful.
Jim, one of the most highly recognized television newsmen in America, said that your closing argument in the Watergate case was the finest he'd ever heard in his 30-plus years as a journalist, and that he had covered trials throughout his career. Were you satisfied with that argument?
Yep.
Tell us what you did to prepare for what later has been suggested by others as one of the finest summations ever given in an American courtroom. What did you do?
Well, Watergate had, the case was so overwhelmingly powerful against the defendants. And they were such characters. They would claim on the stand that we were paying these burglars not to keep them quiet, but for eleemosynary purposes, for charitable purposes. When they do that, I'd play a White House tape where they'd be in the White House saying, look, if we're caught, we can say it's for charitable purpose. And it was funny. And I had an enormous amount of material. And I prepared for that case by, like you really do for everything. You review everything that's happened in the trial. You make voluminous notes. And I think my summation was 4 hours. But I had so many notes it was easy. And what I tried to do was I tried to be honest to the fact that this was one historical event. We were establishing, in my view, that the law in this country really does apply to everyone. It applies to the former Attorney General of the United States. It applies to the most powerful two people outside of Nixon in the White House, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. And I applied. I would work Sundays, Saturdays. I remember that I've always been a great Redskins fan, and I remember working on Sundays, preparing the Watergate summation with one eye on the Redskins, and a great old hero of mine, Sonny Jurgensen, who was a quarterback. But it was a great time, and the subject matter was so great.
Jim, U.S. District Judge John Sirica presided over the Watergate prosecution.
Right.
After the case was over and the appeals process is run, he submitted to an interview or two, and he at that time said that you were the finest trial lawyer that he had ever known in his entire life. Tell us about your relationship with Judge Sirica. He's the judge, you're the prosecutor, you're prosecuting the Attorney General of the United States, White House counsel, the senior-most members of Richard Nixon's administration. What was that relationship that you and Judge Sirica had?
Well, we had a good relationship. I've always thought that it's important to a client in a trial to have a decent relationship with the presiding judge, because he can help you honestly, or he can hurt you honestly. I remember when I went out and tried that first major case you're talking about in Minneapolis. As a very young lawyer.
The Drano case.
The Drano case. First thing I did, I'd never been to Minnesota in my life. So first thing I did, look up this old reporter who covered federal courts out in Minneapolis. And I used to ask him about what kind of jurors we going to get here. What do I need to look for? Of course, he was a wise old guy. The presiding judge was a Swede by the name of Nordby. And after talking to me a while, he said, let me just tell you something, son. Says, don't worry about the jurors you're going to get. Says, you convince Judge Nordby that you're right, and he'll take care of the jury. So I had a good relationship with Sirica. Sirica was the one who really caused the discovery that there was a lot more to Watergate than a third great burglary, that the White House was behind it. And so he came to believe that in all of what Mitchell called the White House horrors, he became to believe that that was a bad crowd. And of course I was prosecuting him. And so I was doing what he thought was the right thing.
But Jim, it wasn't just Judge Sirica who made that kind of comment and described you in such glowing terms. John Wilson, who was one of the defense lawyers in that case, likewise wrote a note on a picture and said to Jim Neal, one of the greatest trial lawyers I've ever met in my life, what made you viewed as being above the average? What gave the perception that you were what these people believed you to be in that case? There were a lot of great lawyers in that lawsuit.
Yeah.
A lot of competent lawyers.
Well, yeah, but I had the best side of it, Aubrey. I'm not such a modest guy, but I had the best side of it. And maybe I don't know, maybe they expect this Southern boy to come up there and not go over well in D.C. And I did. I have found that Southerners, if they're don't try to be phonies, go over everywhere.
Articles have been published. Commentaries have been written suggesting that your closing argument was unbelievable. But likewise, there are suggestions that the cross-examination of some of the key witnesses was as good as has ever been seen in an American courtroom. How was it that you came prepared to cross-examine crucial witnesses in that case, witnesses who you opine were not going to tell the truth on the stand?
Well, you remember what I said about luck? These people, Mitchell, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, were arrogant. And instead of going to, when they were subpoenaed before the Senate Select Committee on Watergate, instead of going up there and exercising their privilege, they testified. I had it all right there. And then after they did that, I got the White House tapes. So that everything they said before the Senate Select Committee was a lie. And I had the White House tapes to prove it. So if you have the material, you can cross-examine.
New Orleans federal judge Herbert W. Christianberry, who was appointed to the bench before I was born, presided over a case that you and I tried in the early 70s involving Harwell witness Edward Grady Parton.
Right.
When that case was over, he said that your cross-examination of the most crucial government witness in that case was the best he'd ever seen. So I suggest to you that this is part of the strength, part of your skill set as a trial lawyer. Is there anything special about how you analyze and prepare for your cross-examination? This has been said about you in case after case after case.
Well, the first thing you've got to do is not beat yourself. That's the number one rule in trying any case. And then it's preparation. I know the guy you were talking about, his name was Wade McClanahan. I'll never forget it. He was under federal custody, and you and I found out that while he was under federal custody, he was out racing stock cars and kissing women. And he gets on the stand and the government never thinks we'll find that out. And that was fun. He makes himself as a cooperative witness, and he's sorry, and now he's having all this punishment himself. And we spring on him the fact that when he's allegedly having all this punishment himself, the government has allowed him to go out and race stock cars and kiss pretty women. And all you have to do is kind of use that kind of material right, and you can cross-examine.
Jim, let me take you back to one or two other questions about the Watergate prosecution. After that case was over, a number of defendants went to jail and served time. And after they were released, the Attorney General in the Nixon administration, John Mitchell, and you ran into each other in New York. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about the conversation you and Attorney General John Mitchell had after he'd been released from federal prison.
Gee, I don't remember much about that, Aubrey.
Well, that was the
I remember running into him, and I remember in this instance, this is another instance where I got a call from the Department of Justice about how I felt about letting Mitchell and Haldeman and Ehrlichman out. And I again said, look, as far as I'm concerned, they've served enough time, let them out as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, I liked John Mitchell. As a human being, I liked him.
If you'll remember, Jim, you and I were in New York. We ran into John Mitchell on a street corner. He was profusely warm, which amazed me, and very gracious to you. And in the colloquy you and he shared, he shook his finger at you and he said, you know, Jim, my biggest mistake in that case was not retaining you. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
After he'd been in prison.
Yeah, yeah.
Jim, let's move from the Watergate case to what is chronologically the next case that received a lot of national attention and media coverage, and that's the Ford Pinto case.
Right.
The idea of Henry Ford, the patriarch of the family, the head of the Ford Motor Company, a man deeply concerned about his company being prosecuted for reckless homicide, ending up with a law firm in Nashville, Tennessee, and with Jim Neal as lead counsel, it's got to be a great story in and of itself. Tell us about how you became involved in that, and then let's talk about that lawsuit.
Well, I became involved in that because there was a firm, Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, and Phil Lacovera was a part of Watergate. He was involved in Watergate. He was part of the Watergate prosecution staff. And you know, there's a good old boy school. This is the way you kind of go. If you kind of achieve some success, you meet some people. If there's another matter comes on and they think highly of you, they talk about that. And so Hughes, Hubbard & Reed was the firm representing Ford Motor Company generally in things, Wall Street law firm. And Phil Lacovera was a partner in that firm. And so when Ford was indicted, Hughes, Hubbard & Reed said, you ought to get Neal and Harwell, Nashville, Tennessee, to represent you. And the next thing I know, we get a call from the general counsel of Ford Motor Company and ask us to come up and see them. And pretty soon we were hired, and we go to Dearborn, Michigan, and we learn how to make a car. And we defend Ford Motor Company, and we did it successfully. A case that was a really interesting case. I spent, and you did too off and on, although you had the firm to run, and I just spent full time in Dearborn. I'd go from plant to plant learning how to make a car and learning how to make, and particularly concentrating on the fuel system of an automobile. I learned a lot of things about that. And I spent some time with Henry Ford, Henry Ford II. Henry the Deuce, they called him. And he and I'd sit around the room, and I was smoking these big cigars, and Henry Ford smoking these little old $25 cigars. 25-cent cigars. We had a great time. I enjoyed him very much.
There have been some fascinating articles and some interesting books published about the Ford Pinto case. That was the first time in American jurisprudence that a major American industrial corporation had been charged with homicide. There are lots of stories about how that case was handled successfully and what led to the not guilty verdict as to all counts. But there's some other stories that have never made print about that. Jim, do you remember after the motion to change venue was granted and the case was transferred from Elkhart to Winamac, Indiana, your first trip to Winamac, to the Pulaski County Courthouse, when we flew in on a small airplane on a private strip with no fixed base operator and had no public transportation to get to town? Do you remember that?
I remember a lot of trips up there and back, and some of them hairy as can be, but I don't remember.
The one I'm referring to is when you and I climbed in the back of a pickup truck and rode on a bale of hay into town to represent the Ford Motor Company.
That's right. My God, I'd forgotten that. Yes, yes.
And we couldn't get motel rooms, you'll recall, because CBS, NBC, ABC, the New York Times, the Washington Post had locked up the only 8 or 10 motel rooms in the community. Do you remember that?
Pretty much. Yeah. Matter of fact, we went out somewhere and found some place that was open for some.
One of the most fascinating aspects of that case that has never been talked about, Jim, had to do with your directives that when Ford arrived in town for the trial on the merits, since it was a small community, that there would not be any stir made. And Henry Ford assured you that that would be in keeping with his wishes and there would be no stir, and sent a senior official down to be the press spokesman. And ultimately, you came to be the press spokesman within 24 hours. Do you recall that?
I recalled he screwed up.
And the call came, put Jim Neal before the cameras and tell another guy to come back to Dearborn. Remember that?
That's right. Sure do remember that, yeah. And we spent a lot of time before the cameras in that case. But You really won that case for us when you found that orderly that really turned the case around.
That was the last time, Jim, until recently, that you and I sat side by side in the courtroom, because if you'll remember, we determined that when we were gone for a significant period of time with a adolescent law firm, the firm sort of went to the dogs during our absence. And so we came back and decided we'd try to go out of town with different schedules and not overlap, remember? Jim, after the Ford Pinto case, which was in, what, 1978? It was in 78.
Boy, they run together. 78, is that right?
78 was Pinto. Then what was the next national high-profile case? Was that the prosecution of the movie director John Landis?
No. That was Bronson Ingram.
Bronson Ingram. Tell us briefly about that, if you would.
Well, Bronson Ingram was indicted in Chicago, and I went up and defended Bronson Ingram.
That's the same Bronson Ingram of Ingram Corporation, Ingram Industries here in Nashville.
And I defended him. I thought he should not have been indicted, and I defended him successfully. And that was a regional case.
But he was found not guilty.
He found not guilty.
And tragically, his brother, who was a co-defendant, was found guilty.
Found guilty, yeah. The next case, I guess Aubrey was, unless I'm forgetting some down the line, was the governor of Louisiana.
Edwin Edwards?
Edwin Edwards.
Edwin Edwards, Jim, I suggest to you, was in 1985.
Okay. Oh, Dr. Nicopolis.
And I was going to say, prior to that, though, you had Elvis Presley's physician.
Dr. Nicopolis, Elvis Presley's doctor, yes.
And that case.
That was national publicity.
That got national publicity.
Yeah.
What was the basic allegation that the prosecutors were making in the Dr. Nick?
This was a state case. The state charged Dr. Nicopolis with the criminal prescription of drugs of Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and some 9 others, alleging that basically he was pushing drugs on Elvis, and the underlying that was the implication that Dr. Nicopolis had killed Elvis Presley because of his illegal drugs prescriptions. And we tried that case in Memphis.
That case resulted in a verdict of not guilty.
Not guilty, for Dr. Nicopolis.
After Dr. Nicopolis, then came, as I recall, chronologically, Edwin Edwards.
Edwin Edwards.
And you moved to New Orleans.
Moved to New Orleans. Defended he was actually governor at the time. He was a sitting governor, and he was indicted for various federal crimes.
There are those who suggest that in modern times, no public official has been the subject of as many grand jury inquiries or as many prosecutions as Governor Edwin Edwards.
Right. I'm sure that's a record that he can lay claim to without fear of contradiction.
You represented Governor Edwards, and that case lasted several months, did it not?
Lasted about 3 months.
And the jury came back.
Took a month to pick the jury.
And why was that?
Well, because he was, everybody in the state knew Governor Edwards, and everybody had an opinion. They either loved him or they hated him. And so we conducted the voir dire one-on-one. We'd bring a juror in, we'd conduct a voir dire on that prospective juror, and then he'd be either challenged, so many of them challenged for cause. It took us a long time to pick that jury.
After that case was tried, Jim, and the jury returned not guilty verdicts, what came next in your career as to the high-profile cases? Was that John Landis?
Yep.
Tell us about the Landis case.
That case
had everything. Hollywood, movie stars, tough prosecutor.
It was the precursor of the O.J. Simpson case.
Right.
John Landis was and is a high-profile director. He had directed Coming to America, American Werewolf in London, Animal House, Blues Brothers, Trading Places, all of those. And he was the director of a film called The Twilight Zone. And one scene required a Huey helicopter to hover over the scene by a stream. And it called for Vic Morrow, the actor, to take 2 little 6-year-old Vietnamese children across the stream. And it was supposed to simulate the bombing of a village in Vietnam. And in making a film that's a bombing, you use pots of black powder, and you ignite the black powder, and it blows way up in the air. And what happened here was the special effects man, who was also indicted, along with the producer and the helicopter pilot, and John Landis, the special effects man set off the black powder bomb prematurely. And it shot up, the flame shot up and destroyed the tail rotor assembly of the helicopter, and it just started whirling around, and it whirled around and landed on Vic Morrow and these two Vietnamese children and cut their heads off, all of which on 6 cameras. And so John Landis was indicted for reckless homicide in the direction of the film.
That case took almost a year to try, did it not?
Took 11 and a half months to try that case.
That was in Los Angeles?
In and for the county of Los Angeles, as they say on the television.
With all that goes with Hollywood and the celebrityhood and people coming in the courtroom who are nationally recognized because of their success in the entertainment world.
Yep.
Jury came back not guilty.
Right. Matter of fact, I defended, who was the guy who played Roosevelt in his movie Sunrise at Campobello?
I don't remember.
An old-time actor. I defended him while I was out there because the prosecutor got on him because he went outside and said, this is a lot of bull prosecuting this guy. So she subpoenaed him. Ralph Bellamy. Ralph Bellamy. Yeah. And so Ralph Bellamy, they handed him a subpoena on the spot, and Ralph Bellamy said, Mr. Neal, you my lawyer, aren't you? I said, I sure am, I called him Mr. Roosevelt. Sure am, Mr. Roosevelt. I'll get this subpoena quashed. It was an interesting case, and I stayed out in Beverly Hills, so I didn't have to stay in downtown L.A.
Well, Jim, back in Nashville, we got regular reports that, notwithstanding your commitment to your client and your work ethic, that there were those weekends when you were hobnobbing with Hollywood stars and starlets. Is there any truth to that?
Oh, not much.
Jim, taking us forward chronologically, after the Landis case, what lawsuit next comes to mind as being a significant one, a high-profile case?
Well, again, regionally, the criminal antitrust case of James Madden down in Shreveport. I had been to Shreveport before that and tried a first-degree murder case in Shreveport years ago. Son of a Nashville family was indicted in Shreveport for first-degree murder. I went down to defend him. But the Madden case was an interesting criminal antitrust case, but that was regional publicity. The next high-profile case, of course, was the Exxon Valdez.
You were on the cover of the American Bar Association Journal, and some publications referred to you as super lawyer. Others referred to you as the have-to-get lawyer in the bet the company cases. How is it, with a 25-man law firm in Nashville, Tennessee, that you ended up representing Exxon in the Valdez case?
Well, these things build on each other. There are books written, there are articles written. The general counsel of Exxon sees an article or sees a book, and you live a long time. If you live long enough, either something very good or something very bad, or sometimes both will happen to you. So, my name would come to people's attention, and it's the strange thing about it, Aubrey, is that if you live in New York, nobody finds that surprising. If you live in Nashville, Tennessee, they find that surprising. That's baloney with the means of communication and transportation we have today. You wouldn't be asking me that question. People wouldn't be asking me that question if I lived in Washington or New York. What's the difference?
I think, Jim, it's a matter of public perception, and there's still a view that some of us who are in the Tennessee bar operate somehow differently than those who are based in Washington or New York, even though in truth and in fact, as you have proven throughout your career, if you can try a case in Chattanooga and prosecute Jimmy Hoffa, and then go to Los Angeles and successfully defend John Landis, and then go to New Orleans and Baton Rouge and successfully defend Governor Edwin Edwards, and the list goes on and on and on, that's viewed differently in our society.
That's amazing. because there are mighty, mighty many fine lawyers in Tennessee. As a matter of fact, Aubrey, as you and I frequently say, gee, I'm disappointed in that X and Y and that big law firm.
Outside of Nashville,
Outside
of the state of Tennessee.
Outside of Nashville, yeah. That's
Jim, you devoted a tremendous amount of your life to Exxon Valdez, and that's a substantial distance from Nashville. Tell us a bit about what your life was like in terms of your packing up and moving to Alaska.
well, the winter colds were something similar to Wyoming, but Alaska's a beautiful, beautiful state. But once you've been there a few weeks, there's not much to do. And so I have to say, my experience in Alaska was pretty a boring time. I spent many, many months there. But after the first few weeks, there's not much to do there.
Jim, you started out in regard to the Valdez representation, focusing on the criminal representation.
Yes, they were indicted for several felonies and several misdemeanors, and I was actually retained only to represent them in the criminal aspects of it.
But over time, that changed and your responsibilities changed. Is that correct?
We were able to work out a real good plea bargain for Exxon so that they'd plead guilty to misdemeanors and the felonies would be dismissed. But then there was the civil trial, and Exxon told me, we spent an awful lot of money on you. You know an awful lot, so you got to help in the civil case. I did help, and we lost $5 billion.
Well, you may have lost $5 billion, but if you remember, Wall Street that day showed their approval or lack of concern about that, and the stock didn't plummet. As a matter of fact, I believe it went up
$2 a share.
$2 a share that day. They were anticipating a much, much higher verdict.
Yeah.
Jim, after Exxon Valdez, what case stands out in your memory as having been a significant lawsuit, either nationally or regionally?
Well, since that time, Aubrey, I've been settling big cases, a lot of substantial cases around the country. A huge criminal antitrust conspiracy case in Birmingham, a regional case, again, in Louisiana. I've spent a lot of time in Louisiana, representing a state case trial involving gaming operations in Louisiana, Gus Majalis. But that's pretty much my last big national high-profile case.
Well, you have had no cases from that time forward that caused your picture to be on the cover of the American Bar Association Journal or caused articles and books to be written in significant numbers, but there have been other cases that you've been involved in. One of the things that intrigues people who don't know you well is how it is that a man born in Oak Grove, Tennessee,
bedroom area of Portland, remember?
A bedroom suburb of Portland, Tennessee, can be so successful in so many venues, including Los Angeles, including Baton Rouge, including, and the list goes on, Alaska. Is there any special technique that give you a certain ability to pick up, to move your practice to a venue of a new case and settle in and have the successes you've had?
People are the same all over, Aubrey. If you treat people with respect, they'll treat you with respect. The idea that somehow you are, because you're a Southerner, that you can't go somewhere and do something, it's just pure myth. People are the same all over. Treat them with respect, be honest with them, and they will treat you with respect. They'll always vote for you in a case, but they'll treat you with respect.
Jim, you made a comment a moment ago I'd like to explore for just a second, and that's in regard to treating people with respect. One of your expressions years ago was, "We never kick the water boy."
Right.
That came about as a result of a driver we had down in Louisiana back in the early 70s, did it not? But it's always been your style to go to restaurants, to be kind to servers, to mix in the communities, and to sort of be a part of those communities where you tried major cases. Is that because you're comfortable doing that, or is that part of
because people are people to me. But it is amusing. That was the old alcoholic that we had. You and I were in Atlanta defending again Edward Grady Parton.
That's right.
The informant in the Hoffa case. We were down there on another defending him, and had this alcoholic that Parton had room next to us, and his duty was to get us up and get us to court in plenty of time. And one morning we don't wake up. You remember this fella? And we go in there, and he'd been on the wagon for so long, and he couldn't get whiskey. He goes in, he drinks bottles of, what was it, Aubrey? Aftershave lotion. Bottle after, wasn't that it?
It was aftershave lotion. It was Old Spice, as a matter of fact. Both yours and mine had been consumed during the night.
Yeah, and he was just passed out in there. But he was the guy who says, Mr. Neal, I like you. You don't kick the water boy.
And that's sort of been one of the expressions that we've used in mentoring our young lawyers over the years.
Yeah.
Jim, in addition to having a phenomenally successful career, being nationally recognized with all the stature and prestige that goes with that, you also periodically taught at the Vanderbilt University School of Law, have you not?
Yeah, I did for several years. And I taught a class last Friday.
Why in the world would a lawyer in your position, with the demands made on your time, carve out teaching responsibilities at the law school?
Well, it doesn't take that much time. I taught for several years at Vanderbilt. You have to pay back. I believe, and let's see, I've spent a lot of time as a government employee, amazingly enough. I spent 2.5 years in the Marine Corps, 3.5 years as Bob Kennedy's assistant, 2 years as U.S. Attorney, 2 years at Watergate. I just think you got to do those things. And it's not totally, part of it is a sense of duty, and part of it is that it comes back to help you. And you know the old saying, is there ever a purely loving deed without a pinch of fear or greed? There's a pinch of greed in all that, but there's also a pinch of feeling that you just can't fail. You must give some of your time to the community in a larger sense, your government, your state. And I've spent, 9 or 10 years overall. And I spent a year as chief counsel to a Senate Select Committee. So 9, 10, 11 years I spent as a government employee.
You're referring to your Senate Select Committee to study undercover operations of the Department of Justice chief counsel position back 15,
Spent a year on that.
Well, you've also been the chairman of the Tennessee Racing Commission.
Oh boy, we really got racing off the ground, didn't we?
Are you the cause for our not having racing?
No, the demise of the racing industry is the reason.
You were named to that position by then Governor Ned McWhorter, were you not?
Right.
Jim, there are those who suggest that, notwithstanding the high-profile cases that you have tried to conclusion and the success in regard to the verdicts that you have experienced in those cases, that some of your greatest successes are those that don't get quite as much publicity and those that don't go to trial. There are those that have commented on your representation of Vice President Al Gore several years ago, to the degree that you can ethically comment on that. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
This is the day in the days when they still had the independent counsel and the need to conduct Watergate-type investigations of everybody. And the Department of Justice, the Republicans charged that Al Gore had committed an offense by making solicitation calls from the White House, and the Republicans were assisting the Department of Justice appoint independent counsel. Well, the Department of Justice has to conduct investigation first, and I represented the Vice President during the Department of Justice investigations of those things, and there were 3 different of those investigations, and I represented them all 3, and there was never any appointment of independent counsel, and there never should have been. And I'm sure the most complete success, Aubrey, you can have, as you know, is defending a guy when there's a government criminal investigation and you managed to avoid an indictment.
Jim, you have received more honors than time allows us to discuss. You know, going back to law school when you were the editor-in-chief of the Law Review and you were Order of the Coif, and you have been honored by your undergraduate school at Wyoming and honored by your law school at Vanderbilt, and you have been inducted into the National Football Foundation Hall of Fame. Is there any particular honor that really stands out in your mind as being maybe a bit more meaningful than some of the others, something that really you really appreciate?
Well, I appreciate now that I've been your partner for, 38 years? How many years is it?
Well, from 1966, when I was carrying your briefcase and having your shoes shine, the partnership began in 71, and so 31 years.
Yeah, 31 years. That's been important to me to be able to sustain a relationship that long.
Well, let's talk about that just a minute before we go to the question I asked. Jim, there are those who suggest that you are occasionally, and I don't suggest this, a bit mercurial, stern taskmaster. There are those who suggest that I occasionally am a bit of a hothead, and yet you and I have never had a disagreement.
No.
In the time we have been together. It's been one of the strengths of our law firm. How is it that with 2 men such as
well,
us,
I think there's a difference in age, and we haven't seen each other as competitors. And you know, when you do that, when you have respect for each other, that pretty well says it, I think. I think, Aubrey, they may be telling me that I've talked enough.
No, we're going to go on for a little bit longer.
Oh,
I want to go back to the honors you've received, because there's a laundry list of those, and you have always been grateful and expressed your appreciation to those who've chosen to honor you. But my question is there any one or two that really stands out in your mind as being something that personally is really important to you?
Well, I guess if I think back on it, I'm not sure that one stands out more than the other, but in some ways you could say that being named distinguished alumnus of the University of Wyoming is important because I was such a horrible student.
You overcame your record.
Yeah. When I was editor-in-chief of the Vanderbilt Law Review, it was my obligation to give a speech. And the professor who introduced me knew of my bad record at Wyoming. And he introduced me as a man who learned to do everything with the football at Wyoming except autograph it. So considering that there was such a terrible record, I'm proud of that.
Jim, we're going to take a brief break, and then we'll come back and wind up the interview of James F. Neal. Jim, we spent a lot of time talking about your successes, talking about lawsuits that you tried, talking about cases that have achieved a lot of public interest, but we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about Jim Neal, not the lawyer, but the man. You've got a family. Tell us a little bit about your family.
Well, I have a lovely wife by the name of Diane. She's a lawyer. I have 2 children, a daughter who lives in Chapel Hill, a son who lives in Dallas. My daughter has 2 young girls. My son is about to have a baby of some sort. His wife is pregnant, so I'll have 3 grandchildren pretty soon. Unfortunately, I don't see as much of them as I'd like to, but I talk to them about every day, one or the other. Have a home on West End Avenue that my wife and I enjoy. We enjoy traveling. I don't enjoy traveling as much as she does, but we enjoy traveling. We've been to New York a couple of times this year. We've been to Wyoming. We've been to California. My wife has been to Europe. I enjoy playing golf with my buddies. Speaking of, roots and that sort of thing, John Sigenthaler, who introduced me to Bob Kennedy, and I play golf once a week. I enjoy playing gin rummy for 2 cents a point with my friend Fred Steltemeyer, whom I've known since 1954. We went through law school together. I drink a scotch every now and then. I read a lot. I've done a lot of different things. I've tried a lot of different things, like I've tried scuba diving. I've actually dived through the wreck of the Rhone down in the British Virgins, where they made the movie. What's the name of that movie where that woman had that wet T-shirt on? Thought I was going to die because I didn't have any experience.
Was that movie The Deep? Is that
The Deep
you're talking about?
The Deep. That was the movie. Jackie Bisset.
Of course, the day you dove that wreck, there were rough seas and it was cold as it could be, and only a real risk taker would have been willing to die.
Listen, Jim Sanders and I decided we were going to go scuba diving, and we vowed that we'd get our certificate, because 95 feet is a good way down for a scuba diver, and then to go through that wreck of that ship.
30 feet below what's recommended for sport divers.
Well, we went down 95 feet, and then we went through that ship. I was scared to death. I'd have given $10,000 if Jim Sanders had said, let's don't do this, because we took one classroom, we attended one classroom when they told us about the bends and the pressure per square inch to sea level and 33 feet below and so forth. And then we had one lesson in a swimming pool, and we got busy in trial, couldn't take any more lessons. But we went down and we dived through that thing. I was scared to death. As soon as I got through that damn ship, I came back up.
And you've not been scuba diving since?
Yeah, I've been down once since then, but I only went 33 feet. 33 feet, so you can pop right back up. And I used to ski. My first injury was not football, but it was snow skiing out in Wyoming. So I've done a lot of things, but what I do now in the sedentary part of my life is to drink scotch, play gin rummy, play a little golf, and read.
Well, there also is an exercise program that you're involved in.
I work out every other day. I get on the treadmill and I kind of walk and jog about 3 miles every other day.
Well, having practiced law with you for more than 30 years, one of the things that I've always admired is your phenomenal stamina. I've seen you go into cases that go month after month after month and not really slow down and maintain what for many would be an impossible pace. What do you attribute your talent and ability to do that to, other than Scotch whiskey?
Scotch and a good cigar.
Scotch and a good cigar.
And good jeans.
You made reference to reading. You do read a lot, do you not?
I do read a good deal.
You're on the Ingram board.
Right.
And
Ingram Industries board, yeah.
Ingram Industries board, and I noticed that you are periodically delivered books from Ingram Book Company, or at least you have been.
Right.
What does Jim Neal enjoy reading?
Oh, I guess I enjoy almost everything. I pick up these books by Grisham and those kind of people, great plain reading material. But I really enjoy things like, for example, Gore Vidal's historical novels, Lincoln, that sort of thing. So I like biographies. I'm reading Theodore Rex now. I like biographies. I like good writers like Vidal's historical novels, Anthony Adverse, Tale of Two Cities by Dickens. I can go back and read those again.
Jim, as part of your personal life, you have for years taken young lawyers into your family and under your wing and mentored them. What has caused this paternalistic sort of attitude that certainly began with me years ago and has continued even to the present with some of the associates in your law firm. Why that?
I don't know whether it's because I get a kick out of these young kids coming up in the practice, or whether it's because I feel so sorry for them. Having started out in a young career the way the profession is today, it's not as near as much fun as it used to be.
Jim, there are those who questioned whether or not this firm would survive back in 1971 when it began. And it has survived, and it's now somewhere approaching 30 lawyers. If you had to do over, what would you change about it? How would you fine-tune that which has taken place?
Well, with a lot of good luck, we've been successful. I still sometimes think that maybe you and I, an associate or two, should have just stopped right there. Although this is not a burden for me, you do the burdensome work of being the managing partner. But every time you increase 30 lawyers, let's say we're taking 2 more. We have a lot of non-lawyer staff. You make more money, I suppose, but you take on a lot more headaches. And sometimes I think we maybe would have been better off with just you and me and a couple of associates.
Jim, why do you think it isn't so much fun for young lawyers now as compared to what it was like when you and I were younger?
The change in the relationship of lawyers, having to do with the fact that we have too many lawyers, I believe. The fact that we advertise, the fact that the competition now has reduced the civility among lawyers enormously, and there's just no way that you can avoid acknowledging that.
Jim, there has been much said about people not seeing themselves as they're seen by those around them, as they're seen by society. The success that you have achieved has been absolutely phenomenal. But notwithstanding those wonderful things you've done and the successes that you've experienced, is there any goal out there that you still have? Is there anything that you want to do? Is there anything that you really think, there's something that I'd like to do? There's a mountain I want to climb. There's a trial there's a case I want to try. Is there anything like that out there?
I hate to say this, but I don't think so. I want to enjoy life. I want to smell the roses. I want to continue practicing. But I don't have to have another big case. My God, I've had more than my share. I don't have to have any more publicity. And that's kind of a nice feeling. So, as I said when we were off camera a while ago, maybe just to be in the obituary page of the New York Times.
Well, I hope that's a long time off, but I'll make that happen.
So do I, my boy.
So do I.
So do I.
And that concludes the interview of James Foster Neal.